The helicopter crashed into the ground at 3 in the morning, bringing to the hospital a man with no memory and no past. She was just a nurse exhausted from endless shifts, but when she looked into his eyes, she didn't know she was standing before one of the most wanted men in the world. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked her phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The text from her mother's doctor still glowed on the screen like a warning she couldn't ignore. "Urgent consultation needed. Please call immediately." She shoved the phone back into her scrubs pocket and forced herself to focus on the clipboard in front of her. Room 314 needed pain medication. Room 318 was asking for ice chips again. And somewhere down the hall, Mrs. Rodriguez was probably wondering why her daughter hadn't visited yet this week. But all Sarah could think about was the growing stack of medical bills on her kitchen table and how she was going to afford whatever new crisis awaited her family. The double doors to the emergency wing burst open with a sound that made every nurse on duty turn their heads. 2 paramedics rushed in, wheeling a stretcher that carried a man covered in mud, blood, and what looked like expensive fabric, torn beyond recognition. Sarah caught a glimpse of his face as they passed her station. Even unconscious, even battered, there was something about him that made her pause. Maybe it was the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, or the strong line of his jaw beneath the cuts and bruises, or maybe it was just her exhaustion playing tricks on her mind after another 16-hour shift. "Helicopter crash about 20 miles north," one of the paramedics shouted to Dr. Martinez as they rolled toward Trauma Bay 2. "No identification found at the scene. Possible head trauma. Definitely some internal bleeding. He's been unconscious for the past hour." Sarah watched them disappear behind the curtains, but something nagged at her. In her 8 years of nursing, she'd learned to trust her instincts. They'd kept her alive in this understaffed, underfunded hospital where one mistake could cost someone their life. And right now, those same instincts were telling her that this mysterious patient was going to change everything. 3 hours later, after the chaos of the emergency room had settled into its usual late-night rhythm, Sarah found herself assigned to the man from the helicopter crash. He'd been moved to the ICU, stable but still unconscious. The doctors had done what they could, but now it was a waiting game. Brain injuries were unpredictable. He might wake up in an hour, or he might never wake up at all. She pushed open the door to his room and immediately noticed something strange. Despite spending hours in a muddy field and then being rushed through emergency surgery, there was a scent in the air that didn't belong in a hospital. It was subtle, almost floral, but definitely there. Jasmine, maybe? Sarah shook her head. She was probably imagining things. The stress of her mother's condition was making her notice things that weren't really there. The patient lay still beneath the white hospital sheets, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision thanks to the ventilator. Someone had cleaned the mud from his face, revealing features that belonged in a magazine rather than a trauma unit. His hands lay folded across his stomach, and Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Despite the crash, despite the dirt and chaos, his fingernails were perfectly manicured. Not just clean, but professionally maintained. In her experience, men who survived helicopter crashes in rural areas didn't typically have manicures that looked like they'd been done that morning. She checked his chart. No name, no insurance information, no emergency contacts. John Doe, the paperwork said, but Sarah had a feeling that whoever he was anything but ordinary. She adjusted his IV drip and checked his vitals, her movements automatic after years of practice. But as she worked, she found herself studying his face. There were laugh lines around his eyes, suggesting someone who smiled often. A small scar above his left eyebrow that looked old, childhood maybe. And when she lifted his wrist to check his pulse, she noticed his watch was missing. But there was a tan line that suggested he wore something expensive and substantial regularly. "Who are you?" she whispered to the silent room. As if in response to her question, his eyelids fluttered. Sarah leaned closer, her heart rate picking up. After 3 days of unconsciousness, any sign of awareness was significant. His lips moved slightly and she thought she heard something that sounded like French. She leaned closer, straining to hear, but whatever he'd been trying to say faded back into silence. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sarah was updating charts at the nurses' station when 2 men in expensive suits walked through the front doors of the hospital. They moved with the confidence of people used to getting their way, and their eyes scanned the lobby like they were looking for someone specific. One of them approached the reception desk, and even from across the room, Sarah could hear his authoritative tone. "We're looking for a patient who would have been brought in 3 nights ago. Helicopter accident. We believe he's one of our company's executives." Sarah's pen stopped moving across the chart. She glanced toward the ICU, where her mysterious patient lay sleeping, and something cold settled in her stomach. Company executives didn't just disappear without people looking for them, and people in suits like those didn't come to small-town hospitals unless something very important was at stake. She finished her charts quickly and made her way to room 314, where her patient remained unconscious but stable. As she checked his monitors, she found herself really looking at him for the first time. The expensive grooming, the perfect dental work she'd noticed when checking his breathing, the way he held himself even in unconsciousness. Everything about him screamed money, power, importance. Everything her mother had taught her to distrust. Growing up, Sarah's family had been the help. Her mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the other side of town, coming home with stories about people who threw away more food in a day than the Hendersons ate in a week. Sarah had learned early that rich people lived by different rules, that they could buy their way out of consequences that would destroy regular families. She'd promised herself she'd never get involved with that world again. But as she watched the steady rise and fall of her patient's chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was different, that he was different. The men in suits spent an hour at the hospital asking questions, showing photographs, taking notes. Sarah managed to catch a glimpse of one of the photos over the receptionist's shoulder. It showed a man in a tuxedo at what looked like a charity gala, surrounded by people in evening wear. The face was familiar, but something was off. The man in the photo had the same general features as her patient, but there was a coldness in his eyes that she'd never seen in the quiet moments she'd spent caring for the unconscious man upstairs. After the men left, Sarah couldn't concentrate on her other patients. She kept finding excuses to check on room 314, to adjust his IV, to monitor his breathing, to look for any sign that he might be waking up. During her lunch break, she did something she'd never done before. She Googled helicopter crash and missing executive, but found nothing that matched the timeline or location. It was during the night shift, when the hospital settled into its quietest hours, that everything changed. Sarah was making her rounds when she heard something from room 314. Not the usual sounds of medical equipment, but something else. Talking. Quiet, but definitely words. She hurried to his room and found him sitting up in bed, his dark eyes open and focused. For a moment, they just stared at each other. He looked confused, maybe a little scared, but there was an intelligence in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Where am I?" His voice was rough from the ventilator, but there was an accent there. Slight, but definitely not American. "You're at Riverside General Hospital," Sarah said, moving closer but keeping her voice gentle. "You were in an accident, a helicopter crash. Do you remember what happened?" He closed his eyes, his forehead creasing with concentration. When he opened them again, there was something that looked like panic. I can't remember anything. My name, how I got here, what happened. It's all blank." Sarah had seen amnesia before, usually temporary after head trauma, but something about the way he said it, the genuine fear in his voice, made her heart ache. She moved to his bedside and checked his pupils with her penlight. Responsive and equal. Good sign. "That's not uncommon after a head injury," she assured him. "Your memories will probably come back gradually. The important thing is that you're awake and alert. How do you feel physically?" He seemed to consider the question seriously, taking inventory of his body like someone used to being precise about details. "Sore, like I've been hit by a truck, but my head doesn't hurt as much as I would have expected." He paused, looking around the room. "This is a hospital." Sarah almost smiled. "Yes, definitely a hospital. Not a very fancy one, but we do good work here." She hesitated, then decided to be direct. "Some men came by earlier looking for you. They said you might be a company executive. Do you remember working for anyone?" The confusion in his eyes deepened. "No, I don't remember anything about work, but something about that doesn't feel right. Like there's something important I'm forgetting." He looked up at her and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. "What's your name?" Sarah Henderson. I'm your nurse." Sarah. He repeated her name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. "Thank you for taking care of me. I have a feeling you've been here more than necessary." She blushed, caught off guard by his perceptiveness. "It's my job." "No," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "It's more than that. I may not remember who I am, but I can recognize kindness when I see it." For the next 2 hours they talked. He couldn't remember his past, but his mind was sharp, his observations keen. He noticed that the IV pump was older than it should be, that the cardiac monitor showed signs of frequent repair, that the chair in his room was mismatched with the rest of the furniture, but he never complained. Instead, he asked about the hospital, about the other patients, about how long Sarah had been a nurse. 8 years, she told him. Started right after nursing school. My mom got sick, and someone needed to have steady work. Your mom? Is she okay? The simple question, asked with genuine concern, almost broke her. She'd been carrying the worry alone for so long that having someone ask felt like a gift. It's complicated. She needs surgery, but the insurance doesn't cover everything, and we can't afford... She stopped herself. This was her patient, not her therapist, but he was looking at her with such compassion that she felt tears threatening. "I'm sorry," he said. "That must be incredibly difficult." "Life is difficult," Sarah said, forcing a smile, "but complaining doesn't pay the bills." Something in his expression changed, became more serious. "What if someone could help?" "With the bills, I mean." Sarah's walls went up immediately. "I don't take charity." "It wouldn't be charity, it would be gratitude from someone whose life you've saved." "You don't even know who you are," Sarah pointed out. "You might not have any money at all." He was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes. "I don't know why, but I'm certain that money isn't going to be a problem." The certainty in his voice sent a chill through Sarah. Rich men had made promises to her family before. Rich men had smiled and spoken of gratitude right up until the moment they forgot poor people existed. She'd learned not to trust beautiful words from beautiful people. "I should let you get some rest," she said, standing up and moving toward the door. "Sarah, wait." She turned back, and the vulnerability in his face almost undid her resolve. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, especially since I don't even know my own name, but could you stay? Just for a few more minutes? Everything feels so uncertain right now, and you're the only thing that feels real." Against every instinct, every hard-learned lesson, every promise she'd made to herself about staying clear of complications, Sarah sat back down. Because sometimes in the quiet moments between heartbeats, the heart makes decisions that the mind knows better than to make, and sometimes those decisions change everything. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the small hospital, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like a warning that neither Sarah nor her mysterious patient was ready to hear. 3 days passed like a blur of stolen moments and growing questions. Sarah found herself making excuses to spend extra time in room 314, bringing her patient books from the hospital library, adjusting his pillows more often than necessary, and finding reasons to check his vitals every hour instead of every 4. She told herself it was because he was still recovering from head trauma, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was falling for a man whose name she didn't even know. He was getting stronger each day, able to sit up for longer periods, to walk to the bathroom on his own, to engage in conversations that revealed a mind sharp enough to cut glass. But his memories remained locked away, surfacing only in fragments that made no sense. He'd mention a song in Italian, then look confused about how he knew it. He'd critique the hospital's coffee with the expertise of someone who'd tasted much better, then wonder aloud where that knowledge came from. "I dreamed about a library last night," he told Sarah as she checked his morning vitals. Massive, with books from floor to ceiling and the smell of old leather. There was a woman there, elderly, with silver hair pulled back in a bun. She was reading to children in what sounded like French. He looked up at Sarah with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Do you think it was a memory?" Sarah paused in adjusting his IV. "Could be. The mind sometimes processes memories as dreams during recovery." She didn't mention that she'd been dreaming too. Dreams about walking through gardens that smelled like jasmine, wearing dresses that cost more than her monthly salary, dancing in ballrooms, while orchestras played music she'd never heard but somehow knew by heart. The strange scent that had puzzled her on his first night was stronger now, despite the hospital soap and antiseptic. When she'd finally gotten the courage to ask him about it, he'd looked genuinely surprised. "I don't smell anything unusual," he'd said, lifting his wrist to his nose. "But you're the second person who's mentioned something about Jasmine." "Second person?" "One of the orderlies said something yesterday. Asked if I was wearing cologne." He'd shrugged, but Sarah could see the frustration in his eyes. Another piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. It was Tuesday morning when everything started to unravel. Sarah was at the nurse's station, trying to focus on medication schedules while sneaking glances toward room 314, when the elevator doors opened and out stepped the most elegant woman Sarah had ever seen in person. She moved like she owned the world, in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, despite what must have been hours of travel. The woman approached the reception desk with the confidence of someone used to getting immediate attention. "I'm here to see my fiancé," she announced, her voice carrying just a trace of an accent that might have been French. "He was brought here after a helicopter accident 5 days ago." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She watched from across the lobby as the woman produced a leather folder filled with documents, photographs, what looked like identification papers. The receptionist's eyes widened as she reviewed the materials, then picked up the phone to call Dr. Martinez. 20 minutes later, Sarah was called into the conference room, where Dr. Martinez, the woman, and 2 hospital administrators were seated around a table covered with paperwork. The woman looked up as Sarah entered, and her smile was warm but calculating. "Ah, you must be the nurse who's been caring for Alexandra," the woman said, rising gracefully to extend a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Celeste Dubois. Alexandra is my fiancée." Alexandra. Finally, a name for the man who'd been occupying her thoughts for days. But hearing it from this woman's lips felt like a theft. Dr. Martinez gestured for Sarah to sit. "Miss Dubois has provided extensive documentation proving the patient's identity. Alexandra Beaumont, CEO of Beaumont Industries, a multinational corporation based in Paris. He was in the United States on business when his helicopter went down." Sarah stared at the photographs spread across the table. They showed her patient at various formal events, always in expensive clothing, always surrounded by people who radiated wealth and power. But something was wrong. The man in the photos looked like Alexandra, but there was a hardness in his expression that she'd never seen during their quiet conversations. "How long have you been engaged?" Sarah heard herself ask. Celeste's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. 2 years. We were planning our wedding for this fall." She pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a photo of herself and Alexandra on what looked like a yacht. They were both smiling, but there was no warmth in the image. It looked more like a business arrangement than a love story. "I'd like to see him now," Celeste continued, standing and smoothing her skirt. The poor darling must be so confused. As they walked toward room 314, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known this was too good to be true. Men like Alexandra didn't fall for small-town nurses. They belonged to women like Celeste, who could match their sophistication and social status. But when they entered the room and Alexandra looked up, Sarah saw something that gave her hope. There was no recognition in his eyes when he looked at Celeste, no spark of memory or affection. If anything, he seemed to shrink back against his pillows. "Alexandra, darling," Celeste purred, moving to his bedside with practiced grace. "Thank God you're alive. I've been so worried." Alexandra looked from Celeste to Sarah, confusion written across his face. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember you. The doctors say I have amnesia from the head injury." "Of course you don't remember, chérie," Celeste said, her voice dripping with sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "But don't worry. I'm here now, and I'll help you remember everything. We have such wonderful memories together." Sarah watched Alexandra's face carefully. She'd learned to read his expressions over the past few days, and what she saw there wasn't confusion about forgotten love. It was discomfort, maybe even instinctive distrust. "Perhaps we should give them some privacy," Dr. Martinez suggested, but Alexandra spoke up quickly. "Actually, I'd prefer if Sarah stayed. She's been taking excellent care of me." Celeste's smile grew strained. "Of course. How thoughtful of you to be so dedicated to your patients." she said to Sarah, though her tone suggested anything but gratitude. Over the next hour, Celeste tried everything to trigger Alexandra's memories. She showed him photos, told him stories about romantic dinners and weekend trips, even sprayed some perfume on her wrist that she claimed was his favorite. But none of it worked. If anything, Alexandra seemed more uncomfortable with each passing minute. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice gentle but firm. "I wish I could remember, but none of this feels familiar." "It will come back," Celeste insisted, but Sarah could see cracks forming in her perfect composure. "The doctor says these things take time." After Celeste left to check into the town's only decent hotel, promising to return the next morning, Sarah found herself alone with Alexandra again. He was staring out the window at the parking lot, his expression troubled. "She seems nice," Sarah said carefully. "Does she?" Alexandra turned to look at her. "Because something about her feels wrong. Not wrong exactly, but not right either. Like wearing shoes that don't fit." Sarah's heart leaped, but she forced herself to stay professional. Memory loss can make familiar people seem strange. It's normal to feel disconnected from your past. Is it normal to feel more connected to someone you've known for 5 days than to someone you're supposed to marry? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah busied herself checking his chart, afraid to meet his eyes. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow will probably be overwhelming with your fiancé here." "Sarah." The way he said her name made her look up despite herself. "What if she's not who she says she is? What do you mean?" "Call it instinct, but something doesn't add up. The way she looked at me wasn't like someone seeing their lost love. It was like she was evaluating merchandise." Before Sarah could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Voices, urgent and concerned. Sarah stepped out of the room to see 2 security guards escorting a disheveled man away from the elevators. He was shouting something in what sounded like French, gesturing wildly toward the ICU wing. "What's going on?" Sarah asked one of the nurses. "Some guy claiming to be looking for his brother said something about a helicopter crash and a missing person. Security's escorting him out because he doesn't have proper ID." Sarah's blood chilled. She watched through the lobby windows as the man was escorted to a waiting car. Just before he got in, he turned back toward the hospital and shouted something that made Sarah's knees weak. "Alexandra Beaumont is my brother. The woman you have with him is not his fiancée." The car drove away, leaving Sarah staring after it with her heart pounding. She looked back toward room 314, where Alexandra was probably still puzzling over his strange reaction to Celeste. Then she thought about the elegant woman with her perfect documentation and practiced story. What if they were both lying? Or what if the truth was more complicated than anyone realized? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the man who'd been escorted away, about his desperate claim, about the way Celeste's eyes had gone cold when Alexandra didn't respond to her as expected. During her break, she did something she probably shouldn't have. She used the hospital's computer to search for Alexandra Beaumont online. What she found made her stomach drop. There were hundreds of photos, dozens of articles, extensive coverage of one of France's most eligible bachelors. But the more she studied the images, the more convinced she became that something was terribly wrong. The Alexandra Beaumont in the photos was definitely her patient. Same face, same build, same distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. But the man in the pictures looked cold, calculating, arrogant. He was photographed at exclusive events, always surrounded by beautiful women, always wearing clothes that cost more than most people's cars. There were quotes attributed to him that revealed someone obsessed with profit margins and market dominance, someone who saw people as assets to be managed rather than human beings to be valued. But the man she'd been caring for was nothing like that. He was kind, thoughtful, genuinely interested in other people's well-being. He'd asked about every patient on the floor, remembered the names of orderlies and janitors, and worried about Sarah's mother, even though he'd never met her. Either the accident had completely changed his personality, or the man in her patient room wasn't Alexandra Beaumont at all. The next morning brought answers Sarah wasn't prepared for. She was checking Alexandra's vitals when he suddenly gripped her wrist, his eyes wide with panic. "Sarah, I remembered something. About the helicopter crash. What did you remember? I wasn't alone. There was someone else with me, someone who..." He closed his eyes, concentrating. "Someone who looked like me. We were arguing about something. Money, I think, or maybe family business. And then there was a sound like, he shuddered, like metal tearing. Sarah's mouth went dry. Someone who looked like you? A brother maybe? Or a cousin? The memory is hazy, but I'm certain there was someone else. He opened his eyes and looked at her with growing urgency. Sarah, what if the person everyone thinks is Alexandra Beaumont is dead? What if I'm someone else entirely? Before Sarah could respond, Celeste appeared in the doorway, her perfect smile fixed in place. But Sarah noticed she'd been listening, and there was something predatory in her expression. "Good morning, darling," Celeste said, moving into the room like she owned it. "I hope you slept well. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have some wonderful ideas about how to help restore your memory." She pulled a small device from her purse, something that looked like a digital recorder. "I thought perhaps hearing your own voice might help. I recorded some of our conversations before you left for America." She pressed play, and Alexandra's voice filled the room. But Sarah noticed immediately that something was off about the tone, the inflection. The voice was right, but the personality behind it was all wrong. "Turn it off," Alexandra said quietly. "But darling, it might help you remember." "I said, turn it off." There was steel in his voice now, an authority that made even Celeste step back. After a tense moment, she clicked off the recorder. "Perhaps you're just tired. We can try again later." When Celeste left to get coffee, Alexandra turned to Sarah with desperation in his eyes. "I need your help. Something is very wrong here, and I think I'm in danger." "What kind of danger?" "I don't know yet, but my instincts are screaming at me to be careful. That woman isn't who she claims to be. And I'm starting to think the Alexandra Beaumont in all those newspaper articles isn't who I really am either." Sarah looked into his eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Then we need to find out the truth, because that man who was escorted out yesterday claimed to be looking for his brother. And he said the woman with you wasn't your real fiancée." The heart monitor next to Alexandra's bed began beeping faster as his pulse accelerated. Whatever the truth was about his identity, about Celeste, about the helicopter crash, and the mysterious brother, one thing was becoming clear. Someone was lying. And people who lie about helicopter crashes and missing persons usually have very dangerous reasons for doing so. That evening, Sarah made a decision that went against every rule in the nursing handbook. She was going to help Alexandra uncover the truth, even if it cost her everything. After her official shift ended, she returned to the hospital through the staff entrance, using her key card to access areas that were off-limits to visitors. If Celeste was lying about who she was, there had to be evidence somewhere. She started in the administrative office, searching through the paperwork Celeste had provided. The documents looked legitimate, but Sarah had learned to pay attention to details during her years in healthcare. The engagement photos seemed staged, like professional shots rather than candid moments between lovers. The medical records Celeste claimed to have were oddly incomplete, missing the kind of personal details that real fiancés would know by heart. But it was when Sarah found Celeste's purse, left unattended in the family consultation room, that everything changed. Inside was a second cell phone, one that Celeste had kept hidden during her meetings with the doctors. Sarah knew she was crossing a line, but something about Alexandra's growing fear had convinced her that normal rules didn't apply anymore. The phone's recent calls told a story that made Sarah's hands shake. Multiple calls to numbers in Switzerland, conversations lasting hours, and text messages in French that Sarah couldn't read but recognized as urgent. But it was the photos on the phone that made her blood run cold. Images of Alexandra unconscious in his hospital bed, taken from angles that suggested they were shot secretly through the window. And beneath those photos, messages that even with her limited French, Sarah could tell were about money, timing, and something called the transfer. "Find what you were looking for?" Sarah spun around to find Celeste standing in the doorway. Her perfect composure finally cracked. The elegant woman was gone, replaced by someone with cold eyes and a voice like steel. "I was just..." Sarah started, but Celeste cut her off. "You were just being a curious little nurse who doesn't know when to mind her own business." Celeste stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Do you have any idea what you've stumbled into?" Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why don't you tell me?" Celeste laughed, but there was no humor in it. Alexandre Beaumont is worth approximately $400 million. His family's company has been in business for over 2 centuries, and he's the sole heir to everything. The only problem is, the real Alexandre Beaumont died in that helicopter crash 5 days ago. The room spun around Sarah. What? The man in that hospital bed is Alexandre's half-brother, Marcus, illegitimate son, never acknowledged by the family, but with an unfortunate resemblance to the Golden Boy. Marcus was supposed to die in that crash too, but apparently fate had other plans. Sarah's mind raced. So you're pretending he's Alexandre to... what? Steal his inheritance? Not steal, transfer. There are people who have invested considerable resources into certain business ventures that the real Alexandre was threatening to shut down. Ventures that Marcus, with the right encouragement, would be much more willing to support. You're talking about fraud, identity theft on an international scale. Celeste shrugged. I'm talking about survival. The people I work for don't accept failure gracefully. If Marcus remembers who he really is, if he starts asking the wrong questions, it becomes problematic for everyone involved. Sarah felt sick. What happens to him when you're done using him? That depends entirely on how cooperative he is, and how cooperative you are. Before Sarah could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the hospital. Emergency codes echoed through the hallways, and Sarah could hear the sound of rushing footsteps. Celeste's eyes widened with what looked like genuine panic. What's happening? She demanded. Sarah pushed past her and ran toward the ICU, her nursing instincts overriding everything else. The alarm was coming from room 314. She burst through the door to find Alexandre convulsing, his body rigid with seizure activity. The monitors around his bed screaming warnings about cardiac arrhythmia and dropping blood pressure. "Get Dr. Martinez," Sarah shouted to the orderly who'd followed her in. She immediately began seizure protocol, protecting Alexandre's airway and administering emergency medications. But even as she worked, a terrible thought crossed her mind. The timing was too convenient. Alexandre had been stable for days, showing steady improvement. And suddenly he was having a life-threatening episode just hours after starting to remember things Celeste didn't want him to remember. "What did you give him?" Sarah demanded, as Celeste appeared in the doorway. "I don't know what you're talking about," but Sarah could see the truth in Celeste's eyes. The woman had tried to silence Alexandre permanently, and she'd almost succeeded. The seizure lasted another 3 minutes before the medications took effect, and Alexandre's body finally relaxed. His vital signs stabilized, but he remained unconscious, and Sarah knew that whatever Celeste had used might have caused permanent brain damage. Dr. Martinez arrived and immediately ordered blood tests and a brain scan. As Alexandre was wheeled away for emergency imaging, Sarah found herself alone with Celeste in the empty room. "You tried to kill him," Sarah said quietly. "I tried to solve a problem before it became unsolvable," Celeste replied. Marcus was starting to remember too much. It was either this or something much worse. "Who are you, really?" Celeste studied Sarah for a long moment, as if deciding whether she was worth the truth. "I'm someone who makes problems disappear for people with enough money to pay for that service." The real Alexandre Beaumont had enemies, people who stood to lose billions if his humanitarian project succeeded. His death was convenient for a lot of powerful individuals. And Marcus? Marcus was supposed to be collateral damage, a half-brother nobody cared about, someone whose death wouldn't raise questions. But when he survived, certain people saw an opportunity. A replacement Alexandre who could be controlled, manipulated into making different decisions. Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest. "You're talking about human beings like they're chess pieces. Welcome to the world of international finance, little nurse. People are chess pieces. The only question is, who's playing the game?" The sound of approaching footsteps ended their conversation. Dr. Martinez returned with news that made Sarah's knees weak. The blood tests had revealed traces of a sophisticated neurotoxin, something that could have caused permanent brain damage or death if administered in a larger dose. "We need to call the police," Dr. Martinez said, his face grim. But when they turned to find Celeste, she was gone. So was her purse, her documentation, and any trace that she'd ever been there. The security cameras showed her walking calmly out of the hospital's main entrance, climbing into a black sedan that immediately disappeared into traffic. Alexandra remained unconscious for 18 hours. When he finally woke up, his first word was Sarah's name. She was holding his hand when his eyes opened, and the relief she felt was so overwhelming that she started crying. "Hey," he whispered, his voice rough but his eyes clear. "Why are you crying?" "Because you almost died, and it would have been my fault." "Your fault?" "Sarah, what happened?" Over the next hour, Sarah told him everything. About Celeste's real identity, about the revelation that he was Marcus rather than Alexandra, about the conspiracy that had nearly cost him his life. She watched his face as the pieces fell into place, as he began to remember fragments of his real life. "Marcus Beaumont," he said slowly, testing the name. "I remember now. Growing up in my mother's small apartment in Lyon, watching the news stories about my father's legitimate family, dreaming about what it would be like to be acknowledged as his son." He looked at Sarah with new understanding. "I was flying to meet Alexandra that day. I'd finally gotten the courage to approach him, to tell him I was his brother. The helicopter was his. What do you remember about the crash?" Marcus closed his eyes, concentrating. "Alexandra was angry. He said I was trying to blackmail him, trying to use our resemblance to steal from the family. We were arguing when the engine failed. The last thing I remember is Alexandra reaching for the emergency radio, trying to call for help." His voice broke. "He died trying to save us both." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry. He was my brother and I never got the chance to really know him." Marcus looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "But maybe that's not the tragedy I thought it was. Maybe I was meant to be someone different than Alexandra Beaumont ever could have been." Over the following weeks, as Marcus recovered his full memory and the police investigated the conspiracy that had nearly killed him, Sarah learned the full scope of what they'd uncovered. The real Alexandra had been targeted by a network of criminals who stood to profit from his death. His humanitarian projects would have cost them millions. His ethical business practices would have exposed their illegal operations, and his influence could have led to international investigations that would have destroyed them. Marcus, as the illegitimate son, had been seen as the perfect replacement. Someone who looked like Alexandra but could be controlled, manipulated, eventually eliminated when he was no longer useful. The helicopter crash hadn't been an accident at all, but a carefully planned assassination that had gone wrong when Marcus survived. But there was more. During the investigation, lawyers discovered something that changed everything. Alexandra's grandmother, the family matriarch who had died 2 years earlier, had left a sealed will with specific instructions about what should happen if Alexandra died without children. The entire Beaumont fortune, the company, the properties, everything, was to go to any surviving male heir of the Beaumont bloodline. Marcus was legally entitled to everything his half-brother had inherited. $400 million, Marcus said to Sarah as they sat in the hospital garden 3 weeks after the poisoning attempt. He was finally strong enough to be discharged, but he'd insisted on spending his last afternoon at the place where they'd met. "Can you imagine?" Sarah shook her head. "It's more money than I can even comprehend. Do you know what I want to do with it?" She looked at him, this man who had started as a mystery patient and become the center of her world. "What?" "I want to finish what Alexandra started. The humanitarian projects, the medical initiatives, the programs to bring healthcare to underserved communities." He took her hand. "And I want you to help me." "Marcus, I'm just a nurse from a small town. I don't know anything about running international foundations. You know about taking care of people. You know about seeing someone who's hurt and refusing to give up on them. You know about love that doesn't depend on money or status or what someone can do for you." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You know about everything that matters." Sarah felt her heart racing. "Are you asking me to?" "I'm asking you to marry me, to build a life with me, to help me use this unexpected inheritance to make the world a little bit better than we found it." He smiled, and Sarah could see both the mystery patient who had captured her attention and the confident man he was becoming. "I'm asking you to take a chance on a love story that started with amnesia and almost ended with murder." She thought about her mother, whose surgery could now be paid for without a second thought, about her brothers, who could go to college without crushing debt, about the small-town hospital that could become a model of excellent care with the right funding, about all the patients who could be helped, all the lives that could be saved, all the good that could be done with resources like these. But mostly, she thought about Marcus, about the way he'd looked at her from his hospital bed, seeing her worth when she couldn't see it herself, about his kindness to every person he met, regardless of their status, about how he'd chosen to trust her when trust could have cost him his life. "Yes," she said, and the word came out like a prayer. Yes to all of it. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a garden in Paris, wearing a dress that cost more than her old annual salary, but somehow felt exactly right. The scent of jasmine filled the air, and she finally understood where that mysterious fragrance had come from during Marcus's recovery. It was his grandmother's perfume, a scent so associated with the Beaumont family that it had lingered in his unconscious memory even when everything else was lost. The wedding was small, attended by the hospital staff who had become their family, by Sarah's mother who was now cancer-free, and by her brothers who were thriving in their new schools. There were no society photographers, no elaborate ceremonies, just two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, promising to build a life based on love and service. As they exchanged vows in both English and French, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She'd started as a nurse struggling to pay her family's bills, caring for a mystery patient who might never wake up. She was ending as the wife of one of Europe's wealthiest men, but more importantly, as a partner in a mission to heal the world one person at a time. The Beaumont Foundation, established with Marcus's inheritance, had already begun funding medical clinics in underserved communities around the world. Sarah had discovered a talent for administration and planning that surprised everyone, including herself. She was no longer just a nurse, but a nurse who could influence healthcare policy, fund medical research, and ensure that quality care reached people who had never had access to it before. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked her as they danced their first dance as husband and wife. Leaving the simple life behind, Sarah looked around at the garden full of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Dr. Martinez was there, along with funding for a new cardiac wing at Riverside General. The orderlies and janitors who had befriended Marcus during his recovery were there, several of them now enrolled in nursing programs paid for by foundation scholarships. Even the security guard who had first escorted away the mysterious man claiming to be Alexandra's brother was there. It turned out that man had been a private investigator hired by the family lawyers, and his persistence had ultimately helped expose Celeste's conspiracy. "I didn't leave the simple life behind," Sarah said, resting her head against Marcus's shoulder as they swayed to music played by a string quartet. "I just made it bigger." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah found herself standing alone in the garden, looking up at the stars. Tomorrow, they would fly to Cambodia to visit the first of the medical clinics being built with Beaumont money. Next month, they would be in Brazil, working with local doctors to establish a teaching hospital. In 6 months, they would return to Riverside General to break ground on a research center that would study treatments for the kind of brain injuries that had brought them together. Marcus appeared beside her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about coincidences," Sarah said, leaning back against his chest. "About how many things had to go exactly wrong for them to go exactly right. The helicopter crash, the amnesia, Celeste's greed, even the fact that I was working that particular night. My grandmother used to say that coincidences are just love letters from the universe," Marcus murmured against her hair. "Messages telling us we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Sarah smiled, remembering the scared woman who had received an urgent text about her mother's condition just moments before the most important patient of her career was wheeled through the emergency room doors. She thought about the choices she'd made, the risks she'd taken, the trust she'd given to a man whose name she hadn't even known. Love letters from the universe, indeed. As they walked hand in hand back toward their new life together, Sarah realized that the most important lesson she'd learned wasn't about money or status, or the difference between her old world and her new one. It was about recognizing love when it appears, even in the most unexpected forms, and having the courage to choose it regardless of the cost. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories start with ordinary people doing their jobs with extraordinary care. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a mystery patient with amnesia turns out to be the answer to prayers you didn't even know you were praying. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand and stepped forward into whatever came next, knowing that together they could handle anything the universe decided to send their way.